Good morning. It is Monday, April the 20th. I'm here today with American History Lecture. Question of the day is, how did Dr. King lobby Congress to expand the right to participate in a democratic process? So how did Dr. King lobby Congress to expand the right to participate in a democratic process? So that's your question that comes out of Chapter 29, Section 2, the section that you should have read sometime last week. Um, want to kind of hit a little bit of section 2 with you today. Just going to have that in the questions. So we're challenging segregation, the sit-in movement. Okay. So news of the daring sit-in at Woolworth store. And let me read this to you because this happened at Woolworth store. In the fall of 1955, four young African Americans, Joseph McNeil, Ezel Blair Jr., David Richmond, and Franklin McCain, enrolled in North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College in Greensboro. The four freshmen became close friends and spent evenings talking about civil rights movement. In January 1960, McNeil told his friends that he thought the time had come to take action. He suggested a sit-in at the whites-only lunch counter in the nearby Woolworth's department store. All of us were afraid, Richmond later recalled, but we went and did it. On February 1st, 1960, the four friends entered Woolworth's. They purchased school supplies and then sat at the lunch counter and ordered coffee. When they refused service, Blair said, "I beg your pardon, but you just served us at the checkout counter. Why can't we be served at this here counter?" The students stayed at the counter until it closed, then announced that they would sit at the counter every day until they were given the same service as white customers. As they left the stores, the four were excited, and he recalled, "I just felt I had powers within me, a superhuman strength that could come forward." McCain was also energized, saying, "I probably felt better that day than I had my entire life." Okay. Now, the news of this spread quickly across Greensboro, and the following day, 29 African American students arrived at Woolworth's, determined to sit at the counter until served. But at the end of the week, over 300 students were taking part. So this was growing and growing and growing. And not only in Greensboro, it grew across the South. As word spread of these sit-in movements and people doing this, then they had more and more and more, okay? The sit-in movement, by 1961, it had been held in more than 100 different cities, okay? The sit-in movement brought large numbers of idealistic, energized college students into the civil rights struggle. Many African American students had become discouraged by the slow pace of desegregation. Students like Jesse Jackson, a student leader in North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College, wanted to see things change. Okay. First, the leaders of the NAACP and the SCLC were nervous about the sit-in movement. They feared students did not have the discipline to remain nonviolent if they were provoked enough. But for the most part, students proved them wrong. Those conducting sit-ins were heckled by bystanders, punched, kicked, beaten with clubs, burned with cigarettes, hot coffee, and acid. But most did not fight back. They remained peaceful through the whole time, okay? As the sit-in spread, different student leaders in different states realized that they needed to coordinate their efforts. The person who brought them together was Ella Baker, the 55-year-old executive director of the SCLC. In April of 1960, she invited student leaders to attend a conference at Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina. Baker urged students to concentrate on their own organization instead of joining NAACP or SCLC. So what she did was she came up with the Students Nonviolent Coordination Committee, the SNCC. And then she was chosen as a student leader. They chose Marion Berry, a student leader from Nashville, who later served as the mayor of Washington, D.C., to be the SNCC's first chairperson, okay? Between 60 and 65, they played a key role in desegregating public facilities in dozens of Southern communities. It also began sending volunteers into rural areas in the Deep South to register African Americans to vote. The idea for what came to be called Voter Education Project began with Robert Moss, the SNCC's volunteer from New York. Despite the dangers, many SNCC volunteers headed to Mississippi and other parts of the Deep South. One SNCC organizer, a former sharecropper named Fannie Lou Hammer, had been evicted from her farm after registering to vote. She was then arrested in Mississippi for arguing with other African Americans to register, and she was severely beaten by the police while in jail. But she then helped organize the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and challenged the legality of segregation in the Democratic Party at the 1964 Democratic National Convention. Okay, then you had the Freedom Riders. Okay, early in May of 1961, the Freedom Riders boarded several southbound interstate buses. Then the buses carrying them arrived in Anniston, Birmingham, and Montgomery, Alabama. Angry white mobs attacked them. The mobs slit the bus tires, threw rocks at the windows. In Anniston, someone threw a firebomb into one of the buses, although fortunately no one was killed. In Birmingham, the riders emerged from the bus to face a gang of young men armed with baseball bats, chains, and lead pipes. They beat the riders viciously. One witness later reported you couldn't see their faces through the blood. The head of the police and Birmingham Public Safety Commission, Theophilus Eugene Bull Connor, explained that there had been no police at the bus station because it was Mother's Day and had given many of his officers a day off. That's why no police helped them. FBI evidence later showed that Connor had contacted the local KKK and told them he wanted the Freedom Riders beaten till it looked like a bulldog got a hold of them. The violence in Alabama made national news, shocking many Americans. So this is going on, okay? So Kennedy and civil rights, where did he stand? While campaigning for the president in 1960, Kennedy promised to actively support civil rights movement if elected. His brother Robert Kennedy had used his influence to get Dr. King released from jail after a demonstration in Georgia. African Americans were responding by voting overwhelmingly for Kennedy. Their votes helped him narrowly win the key states, including Illinois. Kennedy carried only 9,000 votes. Once in office, however, Kennedy at first seemed cautious as Eisenhower on civil rights, which disappointed many African Americans. Kennedy did, however, name approximately 40 African Americans to high-level positions in the federal government. He appointed Thurgood Marshall to a judgeship in the Second Circuit Appeals Court in New York, one level below the Supreme Court. He also had African Americans attained to that point. Kennedy also created the Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity to stop federal bureaucracy from discriminating against African American peoples. Okay. The Justice Department, when violence erupts against the Freedom Riders, the Kennedys came to their aid as well, although not at first. At the first time the Freedom Riders took action, Kennedy was preparing for a meeting with Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union. Kennedy did not want violence in the South to disrupt that meeting. After the Freedom Riders were attacked in Montgomery, the Kennedys publicly urged to stop the riders and give everybody a cooling off period. James Farner replied that African Americans have been cooling off for 350 years. To stop the violence, Kennedy made a deal with Senator James Eason of Mississippi, a strong supporter of segregation. Eason would use his influence in Mississippi to prevent violence. Kennedy would not object if Mississippi police arrested Freedom Riders. Eason kept his deal. No violence occurred. When the buses arrived in Jackson, Mississippi, the riders were arrested. Cost of bailing out the riders used up most of Corps' funds. President Kennedy returned from his meeting with Khrushchev and found the Freedom Riders were still active. He changed his position and ordered Interstate Commerce Commission to tighten its regulations against segregation in bus terminals. Robert Kennedy ordered the Justice Department to take legal action against southern cities that were maintaining segregated bus terminals. So things kept building. And there was more and more violence. We can look all the way through this, and there's always violence during this time. There was violence in Birmingham. Mississippi Burning is a movie that you might watch that talks about these Freedom Riders and some of them that were killed because they were registering people to vote. Okay, you might want to check that out. Mississippi Burning, be a good movie to watch. Okay, Civil Rights Act of 1964 determined to introduce a Civil Rights Bill. Kennedy now waited for a dramatic opportunity to address the nation on the issue. Shortly after the violence in Birmingham had shocked the nation, Alabama's Governor George Wallace gave the president his chance. Wallace was committed to segregation. At his inauguration, he had stated, "I draw the line in the dust, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." On June 11th, 63, Wallace personally stood in front of the University of Alabama's admissions office to block the enrollment of 2 African Americans. He stayed until federal marshals ordered him to stand aside. Kennedy seized the moment then. He finally had something in public that wasn't violent that he could actually go after it, okay? And you can read the quote out of Kennedy's address from June 11th of 63. I'll let you read that. You don't need me to read that to you. Now, the next big thing, and if you watched I Have a Dream, the video, if you haven't, it's still in there. You can still click on it and watch it. This was the March on Washington, okay? And that happened on August 28, 1963. More than 200,000 demonstrators of all races went to the Capitol, okay? And they marched across peaceably. And Dr. King gave his I Have a Dream speech. Very uplifting, I guess I'll say. You need to watch it, okay? It's on the Teams app, all right? Civil rights is going to become a law. They try a filibuster, but that doesn't happen. And finally, November 22nd, 1963, let's see. We know that as this was happening in 63, Kennedy gets killed in November, okay? And people thought that it would fall apart, but no. Lyndon Baines Johnson, carried on Kennedy's fight. To the surprise of the civil rights movement, Johnson committed himself wholeheartedly to getting Kennedy's program, including civil rights, through Congress. Unlike Kennedy, Johnson was very familiar with how Congress operated, having served there for many years. He knew how to build public support and how to put pressure on members of Congress to get it done. February of 64, President Kennedy's leadership produced results. The Civil Rights Bill passed the House of Representatives by a majority of 290 to 130. 87 days later, a filibuster, a final vote came to pass. It was 71 to 29 in the Senate. All right. On July 2nd, 1964, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Okay. So it happened. Voter rights was another big thing. Even though they were given the right to vote shortly after the Civil War, they still weren't given the right to vote. You understand that? In the South, they were still not given the right to vote. They were beaten and chased off. The Jim Crow laws, all those things kept them from voting, okay? After the Civil Rights Bill was passed, voting rights were far from secure, okay? They had poll taxes. In 1964, the 24th Amendment ratified in 1964 helped somewhat by eliminating poll taxes. So it took another constitutional amendment to get it stopped, or fees paid to vote in a federal election. African Americans still faced hurdles, however. They were, when they tried to vote, the SCLC and the SNCC stepped up their voter registration efforts in the South. Their members were often attacked, beaten, and several were murdered. Across the South, bombs exploded in African American businesses and churches. Between June and October of 64, arson and bombs destroyed 24 African American churches in Mississippi alone. Okay, the Selma March in January of 1965, the SCLC and Dr. King selected Selma, Alabama as the focal point for their campaign for voting rights. Although African Americans made up a majority of Selma's population, they comprised only 3% of the voting rights, okay? So they had this march, and it came out, there was a brutal attack on Sunday, March 7th, 1965. The march began. Hosea Williams and John Lewis led 500 protesters toward US 80, the route the marchers had planned to follow to Montgomery. As the protesters reached Edmund Pettus Bridge, which was led out of Selma, Sheriff Clark ordered them to disperse. When the marchers kneeled in prayer, more than 200 state troopers and deputized citizens rushed the demonstrators. Many were beaten in full view of television cameras. This became Bloody Sunday, left 50 African Americans hospitalized and many more were injured. Then we get the Voting Rights of 1865, and that finishes up our section. Authorized the Attorney General to send federal examiners to register qualified voters, bypassing local officials who often refused to register African Americans. By the end of that year, 250,000 African Americans had registered new voters. Okay, and this is going to be the voting rights portion of civil rights. Okay, so that kind of sums up section 2. Your question is out there. I won't give you any other work to do with section 2. I'll come back tomorrow. We'll go on from there. I need to let you know that if you aren't getting your work done, incompletes are being filled out. If you are a senior in my history class and you're getting incompletes, there could be a possibility that you might have problems to graduate. Graduation, your last day of school is going to be the same as it was if we'd have been in school all this time. Okay, so you need to go to Skyward, check your incompletes, make sure you don't have any incompletes. If you do, you need to contact me or contact whichever teacher it is and get your incomplete squared away. You don't want to mess up graduating. You need to stay the course and get things done. These are unique times, but you still have to get your work done. Okay. If you have any questions, you can email or call me. My number is 217-639-5099, and you can give me a call and we'll see what we can do. Okay. Stay safe, and I'll be back on here tomorrow. Great day.